Welcome to the Industry Experts Panel at PortfolioWealthGlobal.com. My name is Michelle Holliday. Today, we are welcoming back to the show Mr. WAYNE Jett. WAYNE is a constitutional attorney with a huge historical perspective, which makes him fascinating to listen to. He is the author of The Fruits of Graft, Great Depressions Then and Now. The last time that WAYNE was a guest on our show, we had multiple responses from our audience members requesting WAYNE's thoughts on several other topics that are also within his expertise. So today, we are going to be covering those topics along with his perspectives on the current political events that have taken place since his last appearance, which was back in May. WAYNE, welcome back to the show. How are you today?
Very well. Thanks for having me, Michelle.
We are thrilled to have you here. We're so honored to have you back to the show because everybody loves your economic analysis that you bring to everyone, especially in the big picture of history. So we'd like to start off with the topic of the 1901 plan, WAYNE. It's a very interesting subject, and you have a lot of in-depth knowledge about it. So please begin by giving us an overview in detail of what the 1901 plan is and why we should care about it in comparison to what is happening right now.
Very good question, because it's such an important one for the experience that we've had in America and in the world for the last 100 years and more. But I would like to have your permission to go ahead and go back a little bit further than 1901 to give some perspective to where that plan came from. In 1880, a book called Progress and Poverty was written by a man named Henry George. He was at the time of the writing, he was in bankruptcy in California as a small newspaper man in Northern California. An honest one and an able one. And to tell you the truth, that book is so well written that I was astonished that I had never heard about it when I incidentally put my hand on it on a library shelf when I was researching my book. But Progress and Poverty essentially laid out the major theories of what causes poverty in the world and debunked each of them in a very, very capable way. So well reasoned that anybody picking the book up and going into them could easily understand and not only understand, but would be persuaded. That book, between the time it was self-published by Henry George and a few friends, it immediately sold 5,000 copies, and so they got a New York publisher when they couldn't get one before. And it sold 2 million copies between 1880 and 1900 thereabouts, and is still in print today. In any event, that book described and debunked those theories of poverty, and then so it said what really causes poverty, and then explaining what really causes poverty. Why we're always led in all of the wrong directions whenever we're trying to solve the problem. He said in one paragraph in his last chapter, there is a powerful pecuniary force that writes laws and molds thoughts in every nation. And this is what leads us down the wrong path. He said not a lot more about it than that, but as a result of writing that book and its sensational effect, it was translated into languages around the world and published in many nations. He became the second or third most admired man in America, almost immediately. And he moved from California to New York City. He was not long after he was moved to New York City, he was begged and persuaded by the labor movement in New York City to run for mayor as a third-party candidate in order to clean up the corruption that was so heavily entrenched in both Republican and Democrat parties there. He decided to run after persuasion. Still to this day, historians say it was the most enlightened and most capably run election contest in the history of New York City. It was neck and neck between two candidates, Henry George and a man who had been I think the majority leader in the House of Representatives as a congressman, but also was a steel magnate who had sold his steel company to Carnegie in order to form U.S. Steel. So he was what we would call a billionaire today. But those two candidates were neck and neck. The pony that was still coming around the back stretch when they were getting to the finish line was Theodore Roosevelt, a fairly young man at the time, but not even a close third. And when the election was counted, Henry George accused them of fraud in the accounting and contested it. But of course, he didn't win in regard to that contest. But finally, he was able to be persuaded to run again in 1998. And
1998.
I'm sorry, 1898. Yes. And within 3 or 4 days before the vote, he suddenly died. I can't tell you whether he was murdered or assassinated, but in my estimation, in terms of all the circumstances, clearly there was enough political motivation for him to have been killed so that he couldn't take power and do the kinds of things that would be necessary to clean up the corruption in that city.
Wayne, what you're saying is extraordinary. Let me just recap so that I'm sure that I understand and that we all understand this.
Please do.
This took place in the 1800s. Henry George wrote a book that said at the end that we are being governed by a force that basically is not in our best interest. He then ran for political office, accused them of manipulating the counts of the votes, ran again, and was assassinated 3 or 4 days before the election.
That's my view of his death.
That is so, I'm just recapping this because we can literally see the same thing happening today, and it's almost a mirror of what happened to JFK. JFK, of course, was elected president, so he succeeded in the office he was going for. But it's very interesting this gentleman was up against Theodore Roosevelt. History is fascinating. My mind is blown right now of what you just said, and this all happened.
Yes.
So he ultimately died in 1898. Is that what you said?
That's correct. And in 1901, Theodore Roosevelt became president because he was vice president in the 1900 election. And the president ahead of him was assassinated shortly after taking office. That was William McKinley, I believe. And William McKinley had already been elected, had already served 4 years, and this was his second re-election, or second election as president. But in that second term, he made it clear that he was going to be against any further wars, such as the Spanish-American War that we'd had during his first term. And I believe that he was assassinated because he was going against the ruling cabal, as I would say, who wanted the U.S. to become more prominent in international wars and to become a greater power for their purposes. And in any event, we get to 1901. That is the year of the plan that you inquired about. there was a little book written by a so-called middle-class Englishman. That is, he was not from the ruling elite, but fairly unknown, had written only horror stories and science fiction to that time. His name was H.G. Wells, but he was by no means the academic star or the intellectual star that he supposedly became, largely because of this little book that he published in 1901 called Anticipations of the Reactions of Society to Science and Technology, something of that nature. Very academic, long title that I still can't remember to this day.
Very boring. Don't look at this.
I've got this footnoted, and I actually devote a half a chapter to it near the end of my book, because it is quite significant, and understanding the experiences that Americans and the world have had during the past century and more since the book came out. Essentially, the 1901 book, Anticipations, was the ruling elite's response to progress and poverty, the Henry George book. That is, they said in that book, Anticipations, that we have long ruled the world in two classes, a very stable system, the one that is proper and appropriate. There was a ruling class of ourselves, and there was a servant class who worked and functioned solely at our command. There has intervened in that stable two-class system a third class in the middle that is made up of all these people who are now able to support themselves. They don't rely upon us. They don't follow our orders. They've developed these ideas of so-called democracy, that they are entitled to have a say in the rules of their conduct and their government. And they have grown so enormously that we must act now, or we'll forever be shut out of taking our rightful power again. So we're going to proceed on the basis that we must, at the earliest time, destroy the middle class completely. In order to do that, we will have to destroy the complete fabric of society as it now exists in Western civilization. We're prepared to do this, and this is the plan by which we will act. They actually described their viewpoint and problems about the so-called middle class in much more detail than I can summarize here. But it was very poisonous, very direct in their assessment of it, in terms of are not going to put up with this. Even people who are wealthy are beginning to sympathize with these people and identify with them. And those wealthy people are going to be destroyed too, because we're not going to have them assisting our enemies, the ones that we're working against. So we're going to have things, for example, such as wealth taxes, estate taxes, death taxes, whatever you want to call them. And we'll take the assets of those who are trying to assist the middle class, and we'll certainly take those of the middle class who earn so much that they would wind up with a substantial fortune. We're going to have a graduated income tax in order to tax earned income, which is the hallmark of the middle class, people who are able to support themselves. We're going to support governments on the basis of taxes on that earned income so that the middle class pays the cost. We will shelter our own wealth from that with trusts, or what we now call foundations, charitable foundations. And in effect, we will have this graduated income tax and Internal Revenue Service. And of course, we've seen how they operate. They go after their enemies, that is the middle class, and they leave the wealthy alone. The great foundations, the ones that are so-called working for international peace. For example, I'd like to just divert for a minute from that Anticipations book and tell you that in 1953, there was actually a congressional inquiry into the operation of those big foundations, the charitable foundations that are supposedly looking to the best interests of humanity. Found that the Ford Foundation, for example, straightforwardly told the head of the staff of Congress that was inquiring into this that one of their major objectives was to fold the American education system into the educational objectives of the Soviet Union. You mentioned John F. Kennedy. His father was one of the close cohorts of Franklin Roosevelt in imposing the Great Depression. He was one of the, he was probably the most notorious trader on Wall Street in terms of particularly of the Great Crash itself, which was an imposed crash. It was planned and executed in order to destroy the prosperity of the stock market. There was great criminality in it. Joe Kennedy, the president, the father of President John Kennedy, was deep in the middle of that, and he became a supporter of Franklin Roosevelt, a close advisor, and so forth. And of course, President John F. Kennedy was elected as a candidate believed to be owned by, I mean, the cabal that rules the world thought he was their guy. I believe that his own values led him to revolt from them and to act on behalf of the normal people, the regular people, the middle class. I believe it was probably his experiences in the war and the identification with other soldiers that brought him around to being the right kind of president, one that would actually represent the true interests of the American people. And as soon as he showed that, including his willingness to go against the Federal Reserve, including his willingness to go against the deep state, what we call the deep state now. It was the agency that he said he wanted to smash into 1,000 pieces that still bedevils us to this day with the attempted coup that is going on presently against President Trump.
Now, Wayne, let me ask you a question. Which one is that? Would you call that the FBI, the CIA?
It's the CIA, but the FBI was involved in the assassination of President Kennedy as well. And all of that deep state thing, as soon as he showed that he was not going to be their guy, when they thought they'd put him in office, they weren't going to put up with it, and certainly they demonstrated their power and their complete cruelty in that situation. But they've done so in so many other different ways, and it's very much in line with the same kind of plan I was talking about, the 1901 plan, and what they have executed all this century.
I
Michelle?
just want to say to everyone, it's worth everyone's while to read The Fruits of Graft, the historical perspective of what has happened over the last 150 years. And then it's mind boggling that it's the exact same pattern. Somebody comes out who is knowledgeable, such as JFK, who grew up in that circumstance. But Henry George comes out, says what he needs to say, says the truth, becomes popular among people who want the truth and want freedom and realize that this is actually an attack on the middle class by the elites because they don't want the middle class as competition to them, basically. They want all slaves and they want the elite. It's very interesting that you named who the elite is also, because many people want to know who is the shadow government. We hear about this government that's above politics and above presidents and above kings. And so, but who are they? It's very interesting that you just started into who they actually are. And they're the very organizations that we think of as being the most benevolent on the planet.
Well, they are also the people who own the Federal Reserve. They own the big banks of Wall Street. The big banks of Wall Street are really not what you would call U.S. American banks. They are owned by the international cabal. Their assets are such as those. They are just as if they might as well be European or from any other country in the world. They do not identify anymore with us. The Federal Reserve itself is a private corporation owned and controlled by the banks of Wall Street. They have the majority control. The Federal Reserve is private interests. They operate our currency system for their own profit. It's a fiat currency that will go to zero. Every other fiat currency always has. And I think our objective, and I think the objective of President Trump is to replace that fiat currency with a gold-backed currency again. The reason gold is so important in a currency system is that its value does not change. And so you can gauge the amount of gold that a particular bill of currency relates to, that is how much it's worth, and therefore you can have a stable value of your currency, which is extremely important in having a prosperous economy. And it's extremely important for the average individual to be able to get the value of his labor and to then be able to save it so that it's not taken away from him simply by what happens in Washington, D.C. in terms of how much they spend or how much they tax or something of the sort. You need to have the ability to have the value in your actual pocket so you don't have to rely upon some central government to send you a check that allows you to eat and live, particularly in your old age or when you're raising your children or paying for their school or something of the sort. All of that is extremely important, and there are answers to it. It can be done. These are not things that are unsolvable, but they become extremely problematic when you have this very violent, powerful cabal that has so many veins of influence throughout the world and including in the halls of power in the United States. These are things that have to be dealt with in a comprehensive way. It happens that I think that that's exactly what the controversy is in Washington is all about. They're trying to get out of power the first president of my lifetime who's been in the position to do something about it and willing to do something about it. My goodness, I think the actions so far of this presidency have been well organized and well thought out and well planned enough that it's actually making really substantial progress, which is why we're seeing so much desperation among the cabal-owned politicians, owned and controlled partly by all kinds of evil things that they've gotten them to be recorded doing, crimes that they've committed, that keeps everyone doing the bidding of their instructions. I get to cover some of that in chapter 17 of my book. My book doesn't just cover the Great Depression. It covers the Henry George experience, the Great Depression. It covers all the way through the World Wars, and it covers the tech crash, and it covers 2008. All of those were planned attacks on the financial well-being of the middle class and ordinary people.
We say this a lot, that these are tricks and they're hoaxes and they're this and they're that, but we need to understand why the tricks and hoaxes are happening, because when you start to understand why, and that's what makes this book so incredible, because when you look through the history of it and you understand what they've always thought and what they've always done, and the murders that have taken place specifically because of what's happening now and because of the perspective that our president is now bringing. Therefore, we are seeing exactly what you said. We are seeing the rise of every tool they've got against him. They go after him with the media. They go after him with Hollywood. They go after him with impeachment. They go after him with reputation. And everything he says and does is recorded and speculated against. I don't think, ever seen such a coordinated effort against the man that the people of this country elected. And that's what I think they need to understand. We elect our president. It's not up to Nancy Pelosi or Adam Schiff to decide who is president. And I want you to speak to what's happening right now in comparison to what has happened in the past.
Well, I think that what we're seeing is a power structure attempting to exert power, and they're very concerned that their power is slipping away. It's a very, very substantial project, we'll put it that way, to take on the cabal. And thankfully, as best I can learn, the planning for the Trump presidency certainly pre-existed his running, in the sense that a number of military people, I think, have been instrumental in persuading him to run, and in assisting the planning of how the cabal could be taken on. It is a very daunting thing, to say the least. It's a worldwide endeavor. Lots of intricacies about it, as you can see. But I believe it's progressing quite well. And I think it's on schedule. I think even this impeachment thing, there's a reason to believe that the president has even sort of egged them into it.
I think you're right.
In order to get themselves extended. I mean, how else would we have known, for example, how would we have uncovered the Ukrainian bribery and so forth of the Bidens? And that I feel sure is the very smallest tip of the iceberg in terms of the scale of fraud, the scale of money taken by high officials of previous governments, and even of the people still in power in the Congress and so forth, making them extremely wealthy people when they're supposedly in government jobs with fixed pay. These things need to be unearthed, and I think that by going all of this direction, getting all of the attention, calling all the attention to themselves, and insisting that it is a crime for the President of the United States to inquire into the possible bribery of a previous administration. It's as if it's absolutely off limits for one president to ever look at a previous administration. And when both parties have been the targets of bribery, both Republican and Democrats, there's only one establishment. That's the one that is the global cabal. And they pick Republican candidates, or try to, and they pick Democrat candidates. It happens that we got one that wasn't their pick. And we really need to make the very best use of it, because this chance has only come around once in my lifetime, and I think it's only come around once, maybe all the way back at least to Andrew Jackson. 1836 is when he went out of office after 2 terms. And in those 2 terms, he got rid of the central bank back then. And people in America were well informed about monetary policy all through the 19th century. They only became uneducated about it in the 20th century. After we got the Fed, and the press and media had enough time to tell everybody that the Fed was just like old Uncle Sam or something of the sort, that they were taking good care of us and we didn't need to worry our little heads about these sort of things.
I really think that our educational system became so bad with the rise of the media. I really think there's a huge correlation between that. I think our educational system was based on books and truth before that, and then the rise of the media and the takeover of the media by these global elites, which was... I
think you're very right. And the big media is said to be owned by 6 corporations. Well, my end, looking into that situation, I believe the same family of mutual funds is the major shareholder in all 6. So it's even more centralized than even the 6 corporations, in my estimation.
And it is specifically. I'm gonna ask you, what are you referring to specifically?
I believe the 6 major media corporations. The last I looked, and I may be a little bit out of date, it hardly has to be in the same one, but the Vanguard family of mutual funds, the ones that is the most plain vanilla, the kinds of funds that have the lowest fees and so forth, very large amount of assets, but as of a few years back, they were the largest shareholder in all 6 major media corporations.
Vanguard.
Right.
Interesting. That is incredible. I want to go, before we go, back to one point that you made. You've made so many amazing, this is just an incredible. You're always incredible when you come on the show. But you made the point that it's very interesting that the president of our country, who's the leader of our nation, who's in the one top position to protect our country, his fundamental responsibility is to make sure there's no corruption and to protect our country in the form of not being ripped off. And so when you say, oh, well, this person who ripped us off can't be investigated and called out by the current president because this person has thrown his hat in the ring to become president. It's such a strange, mind-bending philosophy.
Yes, and I think we have a tremendous opportunity now that we've had for the last 2.5 years, to have this kind of possibility to lift the burden, to open the cell doors, whatever you want to call it. I mean, all of this can be applied to American society, I'm sorry to have to say, because it has gone a long way down in the wrong direction. during the entire 20th century. They called it the American century. That was the century in which the most has been done in the history of the world to take down the American people, to take us down as a nation, to pull our nation down with a shadow government, which is exactly, those are the words that were described in that 1901 plan. They would have a shadow government surrounding every nation, and that shadow government would gradually weaken the government of each nation, so that in the final analysis, each nation's government would crumble and fall into their hands, and they would then have full power.
And again, who is the shadow government? Name them specifically for us, Wayne.
Well, the shadow government has a number of different tentacles. But for example, one, we'll say the secretariat of the shadow government is the Council on Foreign Relations. It's like a big secretariat of intellectuals that are centrally controlled, but go into each government agency, each government office and so forth, and make sure the right influences are there, that they influence the Congress as well as each of the administrative bureaus, things of that sort. Those are parts of the plan. But do you then look at the way they influence the so-called intelligence agencies, whether they're the civilian ones or the military ones or whatever? Each of the military services, each of the cabinets of government, the state governments, all of that influence and policy trickles down from the powers that be. And the powers that be largely exert their influence through their ability to feed money into the political apparatus and elect the people that they want in power in the Congress.
I want to go a little bit more into the impeachment situation just very briefly, because you seem to see it as a positive, and I do too. I see this as one of the most extreme. The more I've thought about it, the more I've spoken with people, the more guests have come on the show to enlighten me about the different strategic plans that could take place out of it, the more exciting it becomes, because it's almost a plan, isn't it?
Well,
on the part of the president.
Yes.
Could it be?
Yes. And so what we have as a perspective now, from having an impeachment vote without a crime, it is a strange thing that they have not been able to define a crime that has been committed, and yet impeachment is for high crimes and misdemeanors. I mean, misdemeanors is always something, a trivial crime, one less important than a felony, and yet they haven't even been able to come up with a misdemeanor. And yet they're going to have a trial in the Senate. And guess what? The other party is going to get to have something to say in the Senate trial. And the Senate trial could very well wind up having witnesses presented that tell people things that they have not heard from the press, that they have not heard from the media, that the media has been unwilling to let pass from its tongue. And so we may very well learn of, for example, what business was Burisma really in Ukraine? Was it really an energy company, or was it something else? And exactly who all was getting money from Burisma? Maybe it wasn't just Joe Biden's son. Maybe it was the sons of, say, 3 or 4 other major national political figures who were also on, my goodness, that same board, also getting major payments. And those payments from Burisma are going to turn out to be chicken feed compared to the kinds of bribes involved in other transactions, such, for example, as the Iran deal. These are revelations still to be made, and they are going to be of a size and nature that is going to change the political landscape of our nation, I believe. We have been led around with falsehoods told to us by our press for generations, and we're going to just about have a chance soon, I think, to grow up and learn what our nation has really been about in terms of particularly our political leaders and how they have come to such great wealth by means that is going to be shocking. And in the process, unfortunately, I think we will learn even more of the details of the tremendous criminal wrongs that have been done to ordinary people who get in the way of those kinds of power mongers that have had too much to say about the way our country is ruled. So I think that the days ahead are going to be very enlightening. I think 2020 is going to be a very enlightening year. Some of it is not going to be pleasant, but it's going to be good from the standpoint of revealing crimes that have too long been covered and hidden, and justice has not been done. So I'm looking forward to these days ahead, even though sometimes we feel that it's very unpleasant and very unfair. The unfairness is going to come around to something closer to fairness, I think. Will certainly, I think, have the attention of the country. The reporting on it is still not very good because everything that is said is run through the filter of the major media. And we'll see how it goes as far as getting information out. But we're getting a lot more interesting information now than the media would like us to have. And so I think we're going to keep on that vein, and we'll learn a lot more in the days ahead.
This is going to be very interesting. Wayne, it is always amazing to have you on this show. Please tell everyone how to find your website and also a bit more about your book, where to find it specifically.
All right. My website is classicalcapital.com. Classical, like in classical economics. That's what I think I do. And classical capital, like in capital investment, spelled with an AL.com, classical capital. And my book is right on the home page. You can buy it there for $25, and that includes shipping. The book is hardbound. It is sewn bound. And therefore, I think it will last for generations. And I made it that way because this may be your only chance to have a historical record. Unless it gets a lot more attention, there will be few who know about it. And so far, it is not widely at all known about on major media.
What a beautiful idea for a Christmas gift.
I couldn't agree more. Very few libraries have it. Very few universities have it. Some have bought some copies, but is by no means used in any class yet. And yet it is history, I feel quite certain, that has been known by our economists. I believe it is history that has been known by our historians, and yet they have not published it. The truths I've told about Franklin Roosevelt's very hands-on orchestration of the Great Depression and the Chapter 17 revelation, it was late coming to me as well, that he was regarded as the most empowered operative of this global cabal ever in history, because he was such a professionally capable actor and also clever at the same time. He could do things in a way that could be hidden and seem to be politically popular, but extremely effective in accomplishing the goals of the global cabal, that is to destroy the middle class. And those things need to be known about our history, especially when our university professors are still teaching the opposite to our young people. We need to get this around as many as people as possible, and let them know how to change their worldview and to understand things better, so that they do not have this tendency, not by everybody by any means, but by so many, to grasp at socialism as a central controlled power of government that makes everybody small and weak except the government, and making all your decisions in the center of power. That's where the cabal makes their decisions. It's simply the way they prefer to exercise control over us. Every one of the isms, like fascism and Nazism and communism and socialism, are all central powered exertions of control over ordinary people. And we need to reassess and recalibrate our understanding of how power is exerted. I think that's where my book comes into helping. Even though President Trump was not on the horizon at the time my book was published in 2011, I can't believe it, but it leads right up to the point of saying, boy, we've got a power cabal that has us by the throat, and we need to get rid of it. So thank you again for having me, Michelle.
Oh, it's been so amazing. I want to end by mentioning we are now going into the Christmas season throughout the world. What does this Christmas season, this particular year, mean to you, Wayne?
Oh, that's a good one. It means a deeply held religious belief that makes all the difference in terms of what our life is about, and what our future life is about, and what our responsibilities are. But my part of it is a very big surprise to me. I never expected to be in the role of speaking about economics and economic history and political history and the control of our country. This was not what I expected of myself, but here I am, and glad to be doing what I'm doing. And I hope to be able to somehow keep that in the perspective of our creation, our creator, and where we go from here. I think lots of people are focusing on that as well. And I hope that the world and God's creation is going to have a brighter time in the days and years ahead. I'm very excited about that and hopeful about it.
Yes, beautiful. Thank you so much for coming on this show today.
Thanks for having me, Michelle.
And Merry Christmas to you.
Merry Christmas, Michelle. You too.
Yes. Mr. WAYNE JETT, constitutional attorney, outspoken patriot, the man behind classicalcapital.com, and the author of The Fruits of Graft, Great Depressions Then and Now. For the Industry Experts Panel, I'm Michelle Holliday at PortfolioWealthGlobal.com.